So in this session, we wanted to have a bit of a conversation about where copyright should be going in Australia into the future. And we thought the best way to try and work that out was actually to sit down and have a chat. And like these things, we thought we actually might start with a bit of a get to know who you have on the panel here. And so I did want to start with that question of, what is your creation story? Where do you come from? What has brought you to here? And Rebecca, we might start with you, if that's all right.
I really love this question because it makes me feel like a superhero. So I'd like people to ask me all the time now. Look, my creation story is I grew up in a house without books. And I was one of those little kids that loved reading. And I could never get enough books. So libraries were really essential for me. Down at the Salvos, I knew which volunteers were a soft touch, and I could get books for 1 cent each. And if they were about ponies, that was ideal. If they were about boarding schools and ponies, I was just in heaven. And so for me, books were an escape. They were a way out, and access to books and libraries are what enabled me to grow up into the kind of person that writes books myself, and I still have a really serious habit. And so that's why I think very clearly my career working in copyright, almost 15 years now, you can see a very clear trend in the work that I do where there is a focus on access to knowledge, because that's so important. And I think for others who have grown up like me, you never forget that hunger for something to read. You never forget that. And now we all have a to-read pile that is just impossible to get through. We've got the opposite. We are book obese, right? But you don't forget. So access to knowledge has always been very important to my work, but also support of authors, because they have also been so essential to me and have such a dear place in my heart.
Juliet?
Yes, I am. Look, my story is probably completely the opposite to Rebecca's, in that I was brought up in a world of books and a world of sort of publishing. My father was a publisher, my mother was an editor, my sister's an editor and an author, and I've had my entire career in books. So the importance of them, the people who create them, and the people who read them has been part of my world. I think the difference for me has been, after 30 years on the publisher's side, the gamekeeper turned poacher, or vice versa, and I joined the ASA. And when I first started, I'd hear all these comments about, publishers do this and publishers do that, and I'd think, oh, I'm not sure they really do, and I'm not sure they're doing it on purpose. And over the 3.5 years, I can feel how my attitudes have shifted, because I think that there is a blurring of author and publisher, particularly in this debate, that isn't actually terribly helpful. At times, the needs and issues coincide, but they don't always. So articulating a separate creator's voice, I think, is really important. And like I say, having had a background in understanding how important they are, that's an easy cause to take up.
What about you, Kim?
I knew that was going to come back and bite me. Look, I mean, like both of the other people on the panel, I grew up thinking books were my world. I was one of those nerdy kids, right? The ones who sit and read and read and read and are hopeless at sport. That would be me. So that was my world. And I think the other thing that's relevant to this discussion and to my career is the fact that I was at university at the point where the World Wide Web became a World Wide Web, where it came into existence. I started my degree reading everything on the printed page in dusty law libraries, and then CD-ROMs appeared, and they were amazing. And then the internet appeared, and it was, the World Wide Web and email and all of that, and I wrote my first research project on the WIPO copyright treaties of 1996 that happened while I was at university. And so, that kind of law and technology and everything exciting that was happening in that world, and the amazing access to knowledge, and that all of that brought was incredibly formative in getting me into this copyright space. Trying to work out how to even navigate this new space and how to make it work has fascinated me for a good 20 years now. So that's where I'm coming from in all of this. But let's get down to it, because the thing that we're trying to think about here is copyright reform. And Rebecca, in thinking about the future of copyright reform and riffing off some of the things that we've been hearing just now, you know, your author's interest project, I think, would be interesting to the people in this room and on this panel. And, you know, my understanding here is you're working towards solving like two of the really big problems here: access to knowledge, but also making sure that authors get paid. And I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about that.
So this really came out of my frustrations in working in this space over almost 15 years at how incredibly badly our copyright law actually achieves those two fundamental aims. When we boil right down to it, copyright is about incentives and it's about rewards. So we want to incentivize the creation and dissemination of cultural and informational works, and we want to recognize and reward creators. But when we think about that incentive aim, remember, it's not that that's an aim in and of itself, right? There's a reason why we want to incentivize that creation. We want to incentivize the creation and dissemination of those works in order to promote widespread access to knowledge and culture. That's why we do it. But actually, our system of granting a very long, upfront lump sum award of copyright does a terrible job of actually achieving that aim. Very often it gets in the way of ensuring that access to knowledge and culture actually happens. And we've got lots and lots of evidence about that now. And in fact, I've got a new paper that I've just finished about to make public, where we've had a look at the relative availability of culturally valuable works in different countries, depending on whether they're in the public domain or whether they're in copyright. So we looked at Australia and New Zealand, for example, and then we looked at Canada and the US, and we found that where those books are in the public domain, commercial publishers are making much more in way of investment in getting them available. So copyright for lots of works is getting in the way of those access aims. But at the same time, it's also doing a terrible job of actually recognizing and rewarding creators. Because when you give that lump sum upfront award of rights, that's a very tidy little package that can be extracted from the author as easy as possible. And of course, a rational cultural intermediary doesn't limit themselves to taking the minimum that they need to incentivize their rights. They take everything that they can get, right? Just in case, and why wouldn't you? And we've got to the point where your standard form Hollywood contract doesn't just take all rights on the planet Earth, but throughout the universe at large. So if an extraterrestrial market does emerge, it's still not going to be the artist that actually gets rich. So the current structure is not working to help us on either of those. And in fact, it's really getting in the way. And so this research project is about investigating what happens if we actually take authors' interests seriously, instead of just paying lip service to them or using them as stalking horses to mask other people's economic interests. What kind of thinking could that unlock for helping get authors better paid, but also for freeing up those rights to new investments in order to further those really critical access aims? So that's the idea behind it. We're 1 year in now. We've got funding for 3 more years as well. And we're doing all kinds of work, particularly around this idea of reversion of rights. And so rights reversion is where rights that have previously been licensed or transferred by the author come back to them on a certain trigger. So it might be that a certain amount of time has passed, or there might be some other trigger. And rights reversion is really interesting because it stops copyright from being that lump sum grant of rights. And by transferring them back, it gives authors another bite at the cherry in recognition of the fact that at the beginning, nobody knows, at the time a work is transferred, nobody knows what it's actually going to be worth, not the author, but also not the investor. So returning them to authors gives the author another chance to capture some of that additional value if there is some. But it also frees up the rights and allows us to think about other kinds of options. So for example, it might be, if we think about books, it might be that the book doesn't have very much value, it's no longer in print, the commercial publisher's not really investing in making it available. But if the author could easily get their rights back, and much easier than what we've seen in current author contracts, that opens up new kinds of possibilities. So even if it's not a particularly valuable work, it opens up possibilities for direct licensing to libraries, for example. We've seen from Michael's presentation, there's huge appetite from libraries to make culture available. And they could be licensed everywhere, and then authors remunerated, for example, on a per loan basis. So as soon as you start thinking along these lines and you think about those incentives and rewards, aims, what we actually want to achieve, it does unlock some potentials for some really different thinking about how we could do a better job to achieve both. And one of the really exciting experiments that we've been doing so far, or analyses we've been doing so far, we wanted to test what is actually happening with reversion in Australia. And Australia is actually a minority when it comes to this kind of law. More than half of the world's countries have reversion rights for authors enshrined in their statutes. Thanks very much to Josh Ivaraj, my PhD student, who looked at the law of every single country to find that out, and we've got some amazing data from that. In Australia, though, it's all governed by the contracts. And when I started talking about the need for author rights, which is really just expanding on calls from authors' organisations that have been made over a number of years talking about these problems, got quite a bit of pushback from the industry saying, don't worry your pretty little head about that. It's all taken care of in the contracts. And so I got together with the ASA, and they have an amazing archive of author contracts dating back to about 1960 that they had been giving legal advice on, and they hadn't been accessed by any researcher before. And I said, look, do you think we might possibly talk about whether my research team can have access to that, and we can do some analysis and find out what's been happening? And because you've got this tremendous resource in this archive, we've got this chance to do some longitudinal analysis as well to see what's actually happened differently, what happened to reversion clauses in contracts when the digital era began, for example, and what can we find out? And they were really terrific. They had a good think about it. And eventually they did give us access. We went up there and spent a week in Sydney. And we found just incredibly interesting things in those contracts. And through that work together, we were able to document very, very clearly that there was an enormous problem, a huge shortcomings in the contractual approach to reversion and authors' rights as we do it now in Australia. And as a result of that, that enables us to take the conversation further now and start thinking about, well, we've clearly got these problems, they're clearly now documented, and now we can move the conversation not to whether or not there's a problem, but to what we can do about it. And so that's the kind of thing that we're trying to do with the Authors' Interest Project. And that ultimately, the aim is to gather as much evidence and develop as much new evidence as we can and decide whether there is a case for new fundamental author rights, particularly around reversion in Australia, and if so, what could those look like?
There is so much in there. And I think I ought to give you a chance to respond to some of that, Juliet, because I know that you've been working in this space with authors for some time. Is there anything in that you'd like to pick up on and talk about as things that you consider important from an author's perspective?
Look, I think the really important thing to remember is, and a lot of what Rebecca is doing is teasing it out, is that the relationship between author and publisher is not an equal one. And contractual law, and I'm speaking as a complete layperson and aware I have two legal professors at my left, which I'm trying to ignore, but it seems to me that contractual law works best in any contract when you have equal parties. And once you're at, you know, sort of Jane Harper or John Grisham, you're fine. You're an equal partner and you can have a robust and fair negotiation. But most authors can't. And so it throws into relief what Rebecca's talking about these very, very, you know, we will license the rights for full term of copyright, every single territory, every language, you know, every country in the world, every format that we know of now, that we might know of, that we think we might know of in 100 years, you know, we'll take it all. And in an environment where all authors want is to be published, and I often talk about it with my members, the minute somebody says that to them, even the smartest of authors lose their capacity to think clearly. And they will sign, even though Olivia, who does our contract assessment that is here today, we are almost begging them not to sign some truly horrific contract. They're just hearing the words get published, and they see no further. So the need to really try and make these contracts fair and have the information that Rebecca and Kim are teasing out here is so hugely important, because we don't have the resources to do it ourselves. And it is a way of saying to the publisher, have your turn, but if you can't realise these rights, return them to the author, because there are many more paths for an author now than there were.
I can absolutely attest to the fact that people sign these contracts for publishing without thinking about it. As an Associate Dean Research in the University at the Law School in Sydney, I can assure you that I frequently get contracts presented to me when someone wants to know, oh, can I make a chapter available open access? By the way, they've already signed the contract by this point. No, you signed away everything for all time, and you can't do it. And these are law professors, by the way. They don't even read them or think about them. Look, Juliet, one of the other things that I think is quite interesting about your history is that you joined the Australian Society of Authors just after the Productivity Commission released its draft report into IP arrangements, which I can assure you, after 20 years in this space, was one of the most intense periods of copyright policy debates that I can remember. So I'm wondering what that was like and what you've learned about this debate as you've settled into your role.
Look, it was a baptism of fire, without doubt. I think, though, that it was, in a way, a good place to start, because it was a maelstrom and everybody had very firm opinions, including us. And, of course, everybody had firm opinions. Their opinion was 100% correct, probably including us. And over the last few years, I guess I have found that the lack of listening and the lack of true debate is quite scary in an area that's so important. And even coming here today, it's been expressed to me, all these people saying, oh, you're going into the lion's den. And I'm thinking, oh, that's quite gladiatorial. And we speak in that kind of language, and I think that in any debate that's unhelpful, but when it's the rights of the people who, you know, only have one purpose and thing they want to do, which is to write, that's incredibly damaging. So I think that I've learned, like I say, to start to really try and understand the different points of view. There have been some people in this room who've been enormously helpful in that, and Rebecca's one, and Sue up there, Sue McCarricker from ALIA, the libraries, of really sitting down and saying, where are the things that we truly don't agree on, and what might we do about them? Now, we may not resolve all of those, but I believe we could resolve a lot of them. And that's the part that interests me, because that is in the author's favour. And I think if we got out of the rhetoric, because I think one of the things that the author's side, if you like, finds difficult is the enshrinement of the user in this debate. Now, user having access is incredibly important, and no author would want to stop that. But it needs that balance between the author's right to be able to monetize their IP and the user's right to have access to wonderful content. One can't overwhelm the other. And so I think we could make progress with this type of panel that we don't tend to make in this area.
Hear to that. Look, I think given that we don't have much time, and I do want to make sure that we do have some time to engage with the audience here, I think I might cut straight to the chase now, which is looking forward for the next 20 years or so. What do we need to do, and what to make copyright work in the way that we've all just agreed that we want it to work? And what can we do better than we're doing now? And Rebecca, I might hand over to you first.
So I do think listening, as Juliet said, is absolutely essential. I feel that there's so much tribalism in copyright. We're all buried in our trenches, sort of firing salvos one side against the other. Even the idea that there's sides, I just find so ludicrous. I'm always trying to speak to everybody, and it's kind of funny that it depends which room I'm in, but I'm sort of the devil for both sides of the debate because somebody's always upset with the kinds of things that I'm saying, but it's because they're the things I'm saying based on the evidence that I've found and the research that I've done. I think that the side in favour of fair use has some real responsibility here. I think we have, I'm very openly in favour of fair use on the basis of all of my learning in this area over the last 15 years, and I'm not ashamed of that. And I think it will not harm authors, and in fact be a great contribution to a lot of creative work in Australia. However, I don't know that I've been sensitive enough to the fact that not everybody has the chance to read every fair use case and make their mind up on the basis of that, and that people have, especially creators, have much better and more fun things to do than read those cases. And that very often those creators, especially at this moment in time, are living in a very precarious way. We see creator salaries have been falling. We see that side hustles that full-time writers might have had doing freelance work for newspapers and magazines have dried up, as Facebook and Google have come to vacuum up about 60% of global advertising revenue, despite the fact that they invest very little in creating that content. Those are the realities that creators in Australia are facing at the moment, and they're too busy trying to make ends meet to be, messing around, spending too much time in this debate. So of course they're listening to what they said, and they're afraid. And I don't think, and just take a moment and imagine that you're in that position. We all, well, most of us in this room have regular salaries and superannuation contributions, and we have failed to be sensitive enough to the precarity that so many of the people that would be affected by this change actually live within. And so one of the things that I would like to see as we move forward in this debate is much more emphasis on safeguards and guarantees that it's going to work the way that I think it's going to work. Right? This is a huge experiment that we want to run. That's an experiment with some people's livelihoods, not ours, but other people's livelihoods. And so I think that's a conversation that we should be having. We should be having stakeholders get around the table and come up with ideas about the kinds of safeguards and guarantees that could make this work. And I've got some ideas about that. I know the ACCC, for example, when there's a change to consumer legislation, gets funding to run test cases to figure out, how it's going to work. One of the big fears about fair use is that there would be the need for this litigation that nobody can afford to sort it out. Well, if that's going to be the case, then we put funding aside for that and we run those test cases and we make sure that that's not on creators to do. But there's all other kinds of safeguards and guarantees that we could put in place, and I think it's a failure of our imagination to have thought about that. The other thing that I'd really like to see done differently, though, is to just get rid of this bullshit. I mean that, and the same way as moral philosopher Harry Frankfurt does in his treatise on bullshit. I've written about this in Overland recently, and I just retweeted those articles this morning if you want to check them out. But Harry Frankfurt talks about bullshit as being people saying things regardless to the truth of them in order to achieve a certain end. And we see a lot of bullshit in the copyright debate, and I think the key piece of bullshit is free is not fair. Now, the people who push free is not fair know that we've had a century of copyright law based on the fact that free can be fair. They themselves rely on free exceptions all the time. Anyone who has ever used a search engine or forwarded an email knows free can be fair. It's even definitionally incorrect because, of course, under fair use, if the use is not fair, then it wouldn't be permitted for free, so it doesn't even make any sense, but it's catchy and people have caught on. And what that does, I think, is it says that our concerns in this room are invalid, right? Now, I have worked as the copyright officer for my faculty at my university for over a decade, right? Most of you work at the coalface more than that. We all know that there are genuine problems here. And so people who spout free is not fair, or they say, oh, it's all just about Google, right? That is just no longer acceptable. People have got to open their eyes, and we've got to help them open their eyes and challenge them on that, right? Do you really think, what's more likely? That all of these people from schools and universities and libraries and cultural institutions, we all get together and we volunteer our time and we dedicate our scarce resources to helping out Google? Or do we genuinely have real grievances? There are genuinely real problems with how the system works now. And that's a message I think we have to be much more effective at getting out, and a challenge that we need to make.
Juliet.
I'll never say it again, Rebecca, I promise. Look, I think that we've come a long way and very open to listening. Have we come to fair use? No. But I think that a lot of it is on both sides, a lack of understanding of what that truly means, and reclaiming the fact that you can have protections for people, and protection isn't a dirty word. And I know you use safeguard, which is a nice way of getting around it, actually, Rebecca, because it is, authors are not the power in the relationship, as I said, and therefore ensuring that they can have a future is important. So a lot of work needs to be done around that. But I think the problem, what I'd like to see is that we are all in the same room together, which is rarely the case. And that we are thinking about models right from the publishing contract on that take into account a new world. And, you know, we work with contracts that are fundamentally, I don't know how long, they've certainly been the same for all the time I've been in publishing, and for many years prior to that, and there's little tinkerings done about shares and the occasional right, but fundamentally the contracts are the same. Looking at different models which would lead on to different ways of handling copyright, and through the contract and through legislation, evening up the relationships would all make a huge difference. So that we really, like I say, protect what is important, which is that creators continue to create and they can earn money from their creations, but not be seen as the kind of Luddites who are standing in the way of innovation, because the creators should be the ultimate innovators. And I think that's where they probably feel rather back-footed, that somehow, like I say, they're standing in the way of people doing things differently. We absolutely need to do things differently. We acknowledge the legislation is out of date. We just need, our view is keep the authors at the centre, because it's their IP. It is not the publisher's IP. They license it. It's the author's IP.
Could I just want to, just in the interest of assessing sort of differences and where we stand, can I just get a show of hands, people in this room who think that making sure authors get a fair share in Australian copyright law is a priority? So there's our lion's den.
Yep. Pretty good lions.
Kim, can I throw this question back at you as well? You've been working in this space for a really long time. You've seen a lot of stuff happening. Kind of feels like we still have the same old questions happening over and over, but what do you see for the future? How do we move things forward?
Well, I mean, like both of you, I see this room, right, and this panel, and this conversation that we're having now, which I think is incredibly valuable. And I think we're seeing more of this conversation. The other thing that I would add to everything that's already been said, and drawing back what Michael said just a short time ago, which is we really need the information and the data about what is going on and where the money is going. And, you know, that question of transparency, you know, both to authors about what their material is being used for and how that revenue is going. We need research of the kind that, you know, Rebecca has been doing and that you'll hear more about with the ebook project after lunch. Because the more we get a real handle on what's actually happening out there, the more likely we are to be able to solve the problems. And so that is in part just about communication. There's a lot of problems that people in this room know about that many authors wouldn't necessarily know about or have a handle on. There's, you know, author issues that perhaps I and Rebecca and other people in this room don't have a full handle on. So sometimes it's just sharing the information that's already there, you know, better. But in some cases it is genuinely about doing the hard research that actually will inform us about where the problems are so we can make actually good evidence-based policy. So.
Can I just say, I just wanted to give just a couple of promising signs. I don't want to end this on a... I want us to think about, you know, optimism and hopefulness, because that's, for me, that's what the ADA Forum is always about every year. So some promising signs. Of course, you know, we're having these kinds of conversations more often. Authors and publishers and booksellers and libraries have been sitting down and nutting out just some industry agreements to some really basic things that are grey areas in copyright, but they really shouldn't be. So, for example, they've reached an agreement so that libraries can use the book covers of books in their catalogues in order to promote those books to readers without a threat of litigation. So it's a really basic thing that should always have been permitted, and now libraries know they're not going to get sued. And they're finalising a couple of others as well. There's the wonderfully named Jolie Postman agreement, which is, you know, to make sure, you know, that you've got those kids' books with the little slips in them. They get missing when they get lent out, and then the kids are devastated when they borrow the book and they don't have the little Santa or whatever in the pocket, to allow libraries to just photocopy those and so replace them when they get lost and things like that. So I think that's a really hopeful sign as well. And, you know, as well, I want to shout out to the publishing industry for working so well. I don't think anyone from the APA is here today, but, you know, working really well on implementation of the Marrakesh Agreement. I think that's another promising sign.
They've done a great job.
Yeah.
Okay, so at this point I'm conscious that it is now 1 minute to 1. Apologies for that. But look, if there are some questions out there that you'd like to put, this is your chance. We have a microphone.
Thank you to the panel. It's Luke Hawthorne from Mallisons. My question is to Rebecca and Juliet, but I'm sure Kim probably has some thoughts as well. Just around, Rebecca, your project, is there a greater role here for industry codes and terms of trade and informal mechanisms like that, rather than sort of hardcore statutory tinkering? Just having advised authors on some of those horrible contracts that Juliet was talking about, and simple things like what does out of print mean? Is there a role here for more sort of industry binding agreements or non-binding? In other industries like in film and television, Screen Producers Australia has been really effective at securing sort of what contracts should look like in a best practice space, and is there a role for that rather than, say, legislation?
So the difficulty there, I think, is that there are so many publishers compared to the number of TV stations that we've got. You know, would you say thousands, Juliet, including the teensy ones? Yeah. And they're always popping in and out of existence. And we've looked at, you know, quite a lot of contracts from some of these small publishers, and they tend to be particularly special. So the other thing that's really important is that this is less important but still significant, is that obviously the industry is changing very quickly. So I think absolutely there's a really important role for industry consultation, for designing rights that are suitable for maintaining those incentives that we need for publishers, as well as recognising authors' rights. But what we're really talking about are just sort of basic baseline rights. And they're particularly important because if we don't get it right in the contracts, because the contracts last so long, a publisher will almost universally take rights for the entire term of contract. So the author's right, a lifetime plus another 70 years. And we saw lots of contracts where they said, and by the way, if copyright is extended during that time, we take that as well. So these contracts can last 100 years or more. So if it was not right at the time, it is really important to have some kind of mechanism even later on for redressing that. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a legislation. It might be that there's regulations that are enabled by the legislation that are, you know, subject to regular review, industry, publisher and author consultations together to find those appropriate baseline rights. But we can certainly draw inspiration from the legislatures of other countries. France, for example, has one of the only modern laws that is kind of a statutory response to the old out-of-print clause. And what they say is that if the book has been published for at least 4 years and the author hasn't been paid any royalties or had them credited against an advance for at least 2, they can just write a letter to the publisher and get their rights back. So there's some really interesting models that we can see that are already out there and that are working in practice that we could, you know, learn from.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question, and I think that you can go quite a long way with industry codes and agreeing some standards. There are, though, as Rebecca said, there are just a few of these really fundamental rights, and it may be that the industry discussions can lead helpfully to the legislative ones. Whereas if you can actually show that an agreement that is in place can be made workable with good intent from all parties, then moving to a more legislated change is probably a whole lot easier and a whole lot less threatening for everybody. But it is difficult because you have to do those codes, you do it association to association. And of course, as Rebecca said, there's such a huge spread now with new technology that everybody can call themselves a publisher. We would argue they're not. We'd argue they are publishing services businesses, not publishers, but we haven't won that one yet. And so how you actually govern what happens in that big mess is much more difficult. So that does complicate it.
Could I just mention, sorry, France has also got a voluntary agreement, industry association to association, about transparency and royalty statements at the moment. When I spoke to the main author society there, they told me, look, it's just not working the way that they'd hoped it would. They're not able to really get compliance with that. So that's another thing that I'm bearing in mind when I'm thinking about the merits of the different options.
Two things I would draw out from that. One is that thinking about the order in which things might happen is an interesting point that I think is worth drawing out of what Juliet just said. There may well be a case for trying some industry stuff because, frankly, it is so hard to get any kind of actual legislative reform in this space. So we've got to do something, you know, kind of regardless of the politicians. And thinking about how we might do more of that industry. Also looking right across copyright law. You know, there's all sorts of room for best practice guides and the like, and they've worked quite well, for example, in the context of having fair use. You know, you can then have best practice guides that actually inform how that gets done. And we could do that in fair dealing too, potentially, particularly if we can make fair dealing actually work more flexibly, as was one of the suggestions of the ALRC. The other thing I'd like to draw out from all of this is, the mention of codes of practice and co-regulation and the like does put quite a highlight on the weird way we do copyright compared to almost every other way we do regulation. I've spent a lot of time recently looking at regulatory theory and governance and looking at a number of different industries and the literature about that. And copyright is really weird. It's really weird in the sense that we try to do everything in legislation. It's weird in the sense that we don't apply good governance principles in the way that copyright is managed. I'd love to do a proper review that thought about where there might be room for industry agreements in particular parts of it, where there might be room for more principles-based legislation. I'd really love some good, serious thought about that.
Other questions?
Carolyn had one.
It's actually less of a question and more of a thank you and an observation. Thank you for coming into the Lion's Den. I think it's been a really excellent conversation. As someone who's worked on, I think, every policy debate since Digital Agenda onwards and seen the kind of oppositional discussion that can happen, it is so refreshing to hear a conversation like this, so thank you. And my one little observation is I'm working, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more this afternoon, working at the moment on the New Zealand copyright issues paper in various different ways. I just wanted to throw out one concept from the New Zealand issues paper that I think kind of sums up what we're talking about. And the ministry there has stepped away from this idea of owners and users and, that sort of oppositional language. And they are asking us all to think of our part in the copyright ecosystem. And I think that's a really nice way to think about the sorts of issues that we're talking, that we all play a part. If you are a education body, your teachers are authors, as to you are facilitating access to student information, you are doing a whole range of things and wearing a lot of hats. And I think hopefully that the conversation today has sort of advanced that. But I just wanted to throw that term copyright ecosystem, and maybe we all need to rethink our language around how we can be more facilitative to these types of discussions in policy debates going forward.
That's really valuable, thank you.
It reminds me as well, some of you would have been here a couple of years ago when we did the What If We Could Reimagine Copyright from a non-lawyer perspective. And do you remember Christy Dina was here, the game designer? And she just got up and she gave this amazing talk and she just looked at us all and went, you guys, you're doing like a first-person shooter, but I'd be designing a co-op, a couch cooperative game. And again, that sort of language and that sort of idea, well, actually, if we were working together to achieve those things, wouldn't that be much easier than just leaning up and going pow pow and shooting each other in the head?
Very evocative. Others? No, I think that is probably a good moment anyway to let everybody go to lunch. Thank you very much. I love this panel and I always love this kind of discussion, and I really hope it helps us all move forward a bit. We'll see how much we can... There's a video of this, so hopefully you can all propagate it among your friends and family. Anyway, thank you everybody.